Okay, so now we're going to get down to assembly of our gimbal for the Reconn 3. Now, I've had to do a bit of cutting and trimming and stuff to have this all work, some of which you will have to do. The first thing I had to cut was, if you remember from the previous video, this is the piece that goes on the front of the motor, the front of the motor being where the logo is, the back of the motor being where the wires come out of the motor. Okay, this piece had two little wings hanging off the side of it. They're going to be for a larger motor that goes on a different model. Quinton's just made one part to suit a couple of different applications. I trimmed those wings off because they were going to overhang the sides of the motor, and that would have caught on stuff. I've also cut my boom, and I've sanded it off at the end to let the just given it a bit of a quick sand just to let the bearing sit on it better. But I've cut the boom. In my case, I've gone to 157 millimeters on the boom length. I found that worked nicely for me. Probably 155 you get away with, 160 you get away with. I tend to be a bit pedantic about these things. I found 157 to be the magic number for me. Okay. Now the other thing I had to do, the frame itself predates, of course, the gimbal. In fact, it even predates that particular motor, this particular motor design. So a few things have changed. So what I've done is I've had to just do a little scallop. I've just used a sanding wheel, the larger one, in a Dremel, and always here use breathing protection. You need a dust mask while you work with this stuff. I've just had to do a little scallop out the back there because that allows this little part of the motor, the sort of where the screw goes in, the little mounting bit at the back, just to sit in nicely. And I found the motor actually did, once I did that, sit in properly with the length of it. I thought the length of the hole might not be right, but there's a slide issue. The motor will sit in and work, but when you add this piece to the front of the motor, the wings where the screws go were hitting the plate at extremes of travel. Now you had probably 90 degrees of travel, and if you limited it, and chances are in flight you'll never hit those limits, it would probably be okay, but I'm, fussy. So what I've done is I've also ground out the front here in a bit of a curve that's enough to let this side piece of this swing through. It took me a few goes. On the top plate, I did the same thing, did my little scallop at the back, but I managed to do a sort of more elegant curve, of course you'll see it. And I've had to actually cut completely through this front section to allow where this is going to go through it. Now that cut there is probably a bit big. I probably could have rounded out these corners and made it look more like a thing, more like just it's part of how the cut was originally done. But I decided to leave those two tabs just for, I don't know, a bit more extra strength. I don't think it probably will be, but why grind off stuff you don't have to grind off? You probably could just use a cutting wheel and cut straight down those two lines and it'd be fine. I have no doubt that Quinton will take note of everything in this particular video and probably change designs on plates, but of course he's got plates in stock, so it might be a while before that comes through. I don't know, he might just decide it's not that hard to cut a bit of carbon fibre. Who am I kidding? He will spend 3 months redesigning the whole frame around the fact that, that touches it. Or he might, That's what Quinton's like. It's part of the reason I like the product. He gets a bit obsessive about the tinier details. Alright, so onto the build. First thing we're going to do is bolt the motor mount onto the motor. Now if you look at that mount, it's two-sided. It's not symmetrical. There's a completely flat side, and there's this other side where there's a recess to the actual plate itself. So you've got these thicker ends and a thinner centerpiece. The way it attaches to the back of the motor is this machined out section goes to the motor. So the perfectly flat piece still ends up at the back. It will bolt on both ways, but if you do it the other way, it's not going to sit in the slot properly. All right. A little bit of Loctite on my screw. This is an 8mm M3, and there's 2 holes that line up very nicely, 2 holes that don't. So you use obviously the ones that do line up, which will probably be the 19mm spacing ones. Yes, they will be. You don't use the 16mm space holes. Okay, and that screws onto there. Get it snug. And I found the 5mm are probably just a little bit too short. You probably could get away with using 5mm screws there, but the 8mm give you a nice bit of meat through the plate. Then we attach our boom adapter to the front of the motor, and again, there's 2 holes that lines up with nicely, and I'm using 10mm screws on those. Again, the 8mm are just a little too short to do this. If you've done the big build, if you've watched the video on building the bigger gimbal, all of this will be very familiar. Quinton's trying to keep the number of parts he needs down to a minimum, so he's reusing parts as much as he can on different models. Okay, so that's the motor mounts done. Next thing we want to do is take our boom, make sure our bearings are on it and that they sit correctly in the Delrin mount. Basically, you want them to be able to be spaced apart enough that they're hard to see, but you don't want the inside of the bearing touching the plastic there. You want the bearing basically preferably to line up with the outside edge. I've covered this in the pivoting mounts elsewhere. So this face of the bearing lines up with the outer face, so you want to get that spacing right. You also want to make sure you've got enough rod sticking out the end that when you put the offset adapter on, it goes completely onto the shaft, just for the sake of clamping onto the carbon. I found a nice little O-ring lying around. I think it's out of a tap. It was just lying around in my parts box, and that actually produced a very, very nice little spacer between the two. You will need a bit of space between the two. We'll show you why later. Okay, so I'm going to pop that back aside. All right, I'm going to pop that back aside, and we're going to pop this into here, and I'm going to grab 4 of my 3mm M3 grub screws and attach these two together. Just remember, don't over tighten these. You will crack the carbon fibre if you do it. Just the tiniest bit, and work in opposites. Alright. And that is that assembly done. Sounds funny, but that's most of the build. Yep, that's it. That's most of the build. I will warn you, I did spend probably 20 minutes with wet and dry paper under a tap, just polishing off the end of the tube so the bearings did fit on nicely. If you're using a metal boom, I'm not sure whether this will ship with the carbon or the metal boom in the end, but if you're using a metal boom, it's actually a lot easier to fit the bearings onto the metal booms. Okay, so just snug them up. I'll just go around and make sure they're all firm, but not too tight, because I don't want them cracking the tube. All they really are, they're just stopping the tube pivoting inside that mount, so they don't have to be too tight. They just got to grab. All right, cool. All right, so that's done. I'm going to put that aside. And the other thing we need to assemble is the front half. Now, you should already have your 8-ball assembled if you've done a Recon 3 build. One thing I will mention is the bands. I've talked about this on the other gimbal. I've put 4 hair bands on this. You want it really compressed and solid, because the sensor is going to be on the back plate of the camera. It's really critical that we get all the back plate positioning right, and it's critical we don't have too much play in here. If there's too much spring in here, it will cause the gimbal to oscillate, because the sensor is isolated from the motor by the 8-ball. So there'll be a bit of there can be a bit of oscillation between the two as the sensor's seeing movement in the gimbal, trying to counteract it with the motor, which is causing we'll literally just get the shakes. All right, so just going to temporarily pop this together, because what I want to do is I want to sight through that hole and work out on the case where my sensor's got to go. Because so what I want is the sensor to line up with that hole. So I want the sensor, hello sensor, there we are, to sit so that I'm going to see it right in the middle of that hole. So I'm just looking at that. It's centered on the case, and it's probably about 2 millimeters below. There's a little ridge line there in the case. It's probably about 2 meters below it, the top of the sensor. Note the arrow on the center, you probably can't see it, but the arrow on the center is pointing up. So I'm just eyeballing through that hole, looking at the sensor, right, to see that I have it in the right spot. Okay, now having worked out the right spot, I'm just going to put with a normal everyday pen, this will rub off later if I can find one. I'm just going to put a mark at where the top of the sensor is going to go and a mark where the side of the sensor is going to be. Okay, then I'm going to clip that back off. Take the periscope off, clip the back off. Now I'm doing this now because once the gimbal's assembled, you won't be able to unclip the back plate, and it's easier to put the sensor on when I've got my back plate. So I can just see my pen marks very faintly where the edges of the sensor are going to be. Now, mounting the sensor, you need to be very square, and I stole this trick from a guy called Mr. Mel. He's a bit of a helicopter guru. He came up with a really cool way of building square templates that generally are square and parallel, and it's using Lego. And what I've found is if you take a 12-way piece of Lego and an 8-way piece of Lego and mount them up like this, you get a very, very nice fit over the GoPro plate. It's almost exactly the right size. But what that gives me, because Lego is very square and very straight, that gives me a really, really good template. That's a set square, perfect, that I can hold my sensor against and get it very square on the plate. Okay, and what I can also do is I can use another bit of Lego, and if I just do that, that is lined up almost perfectly with that pen mark. So as long as I've got the underside of this surface lined up with my pen mark there, and that piece there, if I sit the sensor in that corner, it's going to be in the right spot, and it's going to be perfectly square. Okay, so I'm going to peel off the sticky off my tape, which is always a bit tricky. Gotcha. Need better fingernails. Things lined up, square and on. Okay, give it a good squeeze, take my jig away, and there is my sensor on my back plate, perfectly square, nicely positioned. And I can clip the back plate now with sensor back onto my case. Okay, cool, that's done. And that is all we need to pre-assemble. Well, we may as well pop the bracket on. I won't tighten it just yet. But that's all we need to pre-assemble before we start to fit everything into the airframe. So I'm just going to reposition the camera and I'll be back and we'll show you how it all goes into the airframe.